allegations that had been made that he had sort of sold all this information to the Nazis and that he was responsible for all these terrible things that had happened, where people had died, and he denied that he'd ever been a Soviet spy. He supposedly sort of said, yes, I had passed information on to the Nazis.
What kind of work is he doing at these places? Because, like, we've talked with some spies on this podcast, and we've had a lot of guys come in, like yourself, and talk about different ways that espionage can occur. But you have dudes who maybe, in today's terms, maybe someone works at the State Department, but really they're there as a CIA spy. Then you have guys who drop in under an assumed name with a legend, the whole bit, and they live there and they're really working as a spy, and maybe they do a little more on the ground, like hand-to-hand type things, if you know what I mean with that. Like, what was his role in these early settings, be it in Germany and Eastern Europe, focusing on the Soviet Union and the spread of communism?
I think from what I can gather, his main sort of role was, sending out false information and selling of false information, sort of being involved with people who were sort of connected to the White Russian community, which is, another word for essentially, the Ukrainian community in Europe in the 20s and 30s, who, there was a group, obviously, of Russian exiles who were against the communists, and he married a Ukrainian woman. He was accused of sort of selling information to the Nazis, sort of through the conduit of his own brother-in-law.
Wait, what?
So his wife's brother-in-law was involved in selling information to the Nazis, right? And the question is, how much was sort of Ellis cognizant of where this information was going, and what information was it, and why was it being sold? And
that's fast forward in some years, obviously, right?
Yeah. So, but understand that this is all very vague, and I'm trying to essentially sort of explain what the substance of the charges against Ellis are. Is that he was involved in selling information about the British intelligence service to the Germans, right? And
that's what he's charged with.
What he was accused of, and. That also that at some point he was sort of compromised and then sort of ended up sort of working for the Soviets as well, right? There's not much evidence against him in both regards. In fact, there's nothing to show that he was a Soviet agent at any time. There is some sort of evidence to show that he was involved in the trading of information with the Nazis, but you've got to remember sort of. Prior to the Second World War, there was a degree of cooperation between the British and the Germans against their common enemy, which at the time was the Soviet Union, right? So, and that's a story that really hasn't really been explored that much, sort of, as far as I know, from what I've read in sort of history books, is the cooperation between the British and the Germans.
Yeah.
In the early 30s, after sort of Hitler came to power, and obviously people know about appeasement and Neville Chamberlain and everything else, but there was a lot of sort of fairly dark shit going on in the intelligence services of Britain and Germany against the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and I mean, in all honesty, in America, we had some of that problem too with the guys who later formed OSS and CIA. Absolutely.
Yeah. So. My feeling, my takeaway from doing the research and what Ellis was accused of was that he was essentially being instructed by his bosses at MI6 to trade information with the Nazis. And what happened was that at some point he possibly received some sort of money. Now, I don't know what the circumstances are. It cannot be proven what the circumstances were, but at some point there's this allegation that he sort of received money for some information. But, as you know, you've probably looked into, other intelligence stories. Intelligence is not a sort of a straightforward business, and
No.
you're involved in some fairly kind of morally sort of compromising situations. And I think that whatever he was doing, there was no sort of bad intentions, or there was no sort of nefarious kind of plan to undermine his own intelligence service. I think he was involved just in doing something that MI6 wanted him to do, but it wasn't for the the knowledge of anyone else. And then what happened was that after Kim Philby defected to the Soviet Union in 1963, it only took 2 years for Ellis to be hauled into an interrogation room in London, where he was grilled by a sort of a joint committee of MI5 and MI6 officers about why his name was appearing in these interrogation reports of Nazis that had been interviewed after the war. So obviously what happened when Kim Philby defected was they went back to all their archives, they went through all their interrogation reports of Nazis, and they found, who's this Captain Ellis that's supposedly selling information to these German officers? Why do these German officers know this guy called Captain Ellis? Who could that be? And the interesting thing was that one of these reports crossed the desk of Kim Philby, who in 1946 was still working for MI6.
Yeah, so just for context for people out there, I'm going to have you explain this if you don't mind, but Kim Philby was one of the reputed Cambridge 4 or Cambridge 5, whatever it was.
Cambridge 5.
And became the highest ranking MI6 member to ever be revealed as a
Soviet
spy, in this case a Soviet spy. But can you just explain the background of how he was revealed and the defection and all that, just so that people understand?
Well, he was under suspicion really from the early 1950s. And he denied that he was a Russian spy, and it wasn't until 1963 that he was in Beirut in Lebanon, and actually sort of escaped in the middle of the night and ended up in Russia, and suddenly, we've got this massive high-level defection. It's embarrassed the intelligence services of Britain and the United States and Canada and all the other sort of Western intelligence agencies. And what happened was that then there was suddenly a big witch hunt within MI6, MI5, the CIA, to find other sort of possible Soviet moles, right? So they went back over all the sort of the interrogation reports of Nazis, and this is where Ellis's name came up. And going back to 1946, when no one was suspecting Kim Philby, one of these reports went across Kim Philby's desk. Someone said to him, do you have any idea who this guy Ellis might be? And he said, I have no idea who this person is. No further action. Right?
Ellis or Ellie?
Sorry?
Ellis or Ellie?
Ellis.
So actually him.
Yeah, Ellis. Okay. Captain Ellis, right? And but I'll get on to it. There is another Ellie, but I'll talk about that later.
Right.
But Philby wrote, no further action. Even though Ellis and Philby basically sort of shared office space, right? It was a very sort of odd thing for Philby to do. So in the context of the 1960s, something like that looks very odd.
Sure.
And that was really why kind of Ellis fell under suspicion that a Philby might be protecting Ellis, or might have been protecting Ellis at that time, and that Ellis in 1946 could have been a Soviet spy.
And there were the others who were uncut, the Cambridge 4 or 5, whatever it was, who were uncovered to actually be Soviet spies who were associated with Philby.
They've all been exposed eventually, yes, into the 1970s and so on. But at the time, in 1963, Philby was obviously the big one, and everyone was shitting themselves because, like, how did this person operate under our noses for so long, and for us, not to have any idea, and it caused great embarrassment in the United States and Great Britain, and so Ellis was hauled into an interrogation in 1965, and confronted with allegations that had been made that he had sort of sold all this information to the Nazis and that he was responsible for all these terrible things that had happened, where people had died, and he denied that he'd ever been a Soviet spy. He supposedly sort of said, yes, I had passed information on to the Nazis. But the information that we know about what he confessed to has only ever sort of come up in the book Spycatcher, which came out in 1987, which was this mega best-selling book that went around the world by Peter Wright. A book by Chapman Pincher called Their Trade is Treachery, for which Peter Wright, who wrote Spycatcher, was the main source. And books by a guy called Nigel West, who was a well-known espionage author. And, West had his own sources for his case against Ellis, but none of these things have ever been proven. They're all very, very circumstantial, and I think they've drawn a very long bow to kind of accuse Ellis of being a Nazi and Soviet spy. There's no evidence whatsoever that he was a Soviet spy.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.